The old house creaked as Sarah closed the door behind her. She'd agreed to house sit for her aunt while she was away on a month-long cruise, but the decision already felt like a mistake. The house was isolated, miles away from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense woods that seemed alive with whispers as the wind pushed through the trees. Sarah had grown up in the city and wasn't accustomed to the silence that came with rural life. Out here, it was oppressive. Every sound, from the creak of the wooden floorboards to the faint rustle of leaves outside, felt magnified. The first few days passed uneventfully, though Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She dismissed it as her imagination, a product of too many late-night horror movies and the eerie solitude of the house. To keep herself occupied, she'd binge-watch TV shows, clean, and explore the dusty corners of her aunt's home. One night, while scrolling through her phone in the living room, she heard a knock. It wasn't the polite tap-tap of a visitor, but a firm, deliberate knock that echoed through the quiet house. Startled, Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. The knock came again, 3 times, evenly spaced. She stood up, heart pounding, and cautiously approached the front door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. The porch light illuminated the empty steps. She waited a moment longer, then opened the door, just a crack, and called out, "Hello?" Silence. Shaking her head, she closed the door and locked it, telling herself it must have been a branch or the wind. But the knock came again that night, this time from the back door. Her stomach twisted as she grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the source of the sound. Once again, no one was there. By the third night, the knocking had become a nightly occurrence, always from a different door or window. It would happen between midnight and 3 a.m., each knock more insistent than the last. Sarah stopped sleeping, her nerves frayed from the constant interruptions. The house's isolation, once merely unsettling, now felt like a trap. Desperate for answers, she called her aunt. "Has anything strange ever happened at the house?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Her aunt's tone turned serious. "Why? Did something happen?" Sarah hesitated but decided to tell the truth. "There's been knocking at night. No one's there when I check, but it's been happening every night." Her aunt was silent for a moment before she spoke. "Sarah, I don't want to scare you, but I've had experiences in that house too. I've always written it off as the house settling or animals outside, but maybe you should stay somewhere else." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She decided to leave the next morning. But that night, the knocking changed. It was just past midnight when it started. This time, it wasn't a knock, but a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the basement door. Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd avoided the basement since arriving. Something about the steep, dark stairs and the damp smell made her uneasy. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was on the other side was desperate to get in. Clutching her knife, Sarah approached the door. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as she bolted upstairs to her room, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. The signal, which had been weak but usable before, was now completely gone. A new sound reached her ears. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps ascending the stairs. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed her back against the far wall, clutching the knife tightly. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and ragged, as the footsteps stopped outside her door. Knock, knock, knock. Morning came, and the house was eerily quiet. The door to Sarah's room was still locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. Gathering her courage, she packed her bags and left without looking back. She didn't care about her aunt's belongings or the fee she'd been promised for house-sitting. Nothing was worth staying another night. Weeks later, Sarah's aunt returned and called her, apologizing profusely. "I should have warned you," she said. "Years ago, a man disappeared in the woods near the house. Some people say his spirit roams the area, looking for a way back in. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew she'd never set foot in that house again. But sometimes, late at night, she'd hear a faint knock at her apartment door. And when she checked, no one was ever there. When Jenna's parents told her they'd be out of town for the weekend, she was thrilled. At 17, she was more than capable of spending a couple of nights alone, and she relished the idea of having the house to herself. With plans to binge watch her favorite shows and order takeout, she settled in for a quiet weekend. The first night started uneventfully. Jenna made herself a bowl of popcorn, curled up on the couch, and lost herself in a new series. The suburban neighborhood was quiet as always, the faint hum of crickets lulling her into a sense of security. But just as the clock struck midnight, a power outage plunged the house into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening. The TV screen went black, and the soft glow of the living room lamp vanished. Jenna fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to navigate. The outage seemed localized. She could see lights on in houses down the street. Her unease grew as she checked the breaker box in the basement. Everything seemed in order, yet the power wouldn't return. She called her dad, but the call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, Jenna decided to call it a night and headed upstairs to her room. It was around 2 a.m. when she woke to the sound of faint whispers. At first, she thought it was part of a dream, but as her grogginess faded, the whispers became clearer. They were low, indistinct voices, as if multiple people were murmuring just out of earshot. She sat up, straining to listen. The whispers were coming from downstairs. Jenna's heart began to race. She told herself it had to be the TV turning back on. Maybe the power had returned. But when she crept down the stairs, clutching her phone as a makeshift weapon, the house was still cloaked in darkness. The whispers stopped as soon as she reached the bottom step. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. Telling herself it was her imagination, she returned to her room, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house made her jump, her eyes darting to the shadows dancing on the walls. The next day, Jenna tried to shrug off the incident. She busied herself with chores, blasting music from her phone to drown out her nerves. By the time evening came, she felt more like herself. But as night fell, a sense of dread crept in. The memory of the whispers lingered. Around midnight, it happened again. This time, it wasn't whispers, but the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the hallway outside her room. Jenna froze in her bed, clutching the blankets tightly. "Mom? Dad?" she called, knowing full well they weren't home. The footsteps stopped. Summoning every ounce of courage, she grabbed her phone and stepped into the hallway. It was empty. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she checked each room. Nothing. Yet as she turned to head back to her room, she saw it. A shadow moving across the wall at the end of the hall. Jenna stood frozen. The shadow didn't belong to her. There was no one else there. Slowly, the shadow shifted, growing larger as if something was coming closer. Panic overtook her, and she bolted back to her room, slamming the door shut and locking it. The rest of the night was a blur. Jenna stayed awake, clutching her phone and knife, her eyes glued to the door. The shadow never appeared again, but the oppressive silence made her feel as if something was waiting just beyond her sight. The next morning, she called her parents, begging them to come home early. She didn't tell them exactly what happened, only that she didn't feel safe alone. They promised to return that evening. Relieved, Jenna spent the day on edge, but managed to avoid any more strange occurrences. When her parents finally arrived, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She greeted them at the door, explaining how the power had gone out and how she'd heard strange noises. Her mom frowned. "The power went out?" she asked. "That's odd. Everything looks fine." Her dad went to inspect the breaker box while Jenna and her mom headed upstairs. As they reached the top of the stairs, her mom stopped abruptly, staring at the wall at the end of the hallway. "What's wrong?" Jenna asked, her voice shaking. Her mom pointed. Jenna? Who drew that? Jenna followed her gaze and felt her stomach drop. There, scrawled in faint, jagged lines on the wall, was a message. I'm still here. Jenna turned to her mom, tears in her eyes. I swear I didn't. Her mom's face paled. Pack a bag, she said quietly. We're leaving, now. As they hurried out of the house, Jenna glanced back one last time. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, as if watching her go. Emma had always known the third floor of her family's Victorian-era house was off-limits. Her parents called it the locked room, and she'd never dared to question them. But tonight was different. She was home alone for the weekend, and curiosity had a way of gnawing at her when there was no one around to distract her. It started innocently enough. She wandered the house, flipping through old photo albums and poking through drawers. But as the evening wore on, her attention kept drifting to the third-floor staircase. The door at the top was always locked, but earlier that week, Emma had found a strange key hidden in her father's desk. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now the key called to her. She tried to resist, telling herself it was better to leave it alone. But by midnight, her resolve had crumbled. With the key in hand, she ascended the creaking stairs. The door unlocked with a soft click, and Emma pushed it open. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through a grime-covered window. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled stale, like something long forgotten. At first glance, it appeared to be just an old storage room. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, and sheets covered what she assumed were old pieces of furniture. But as she stepped inside, she noticed something odd. A large, ornate mirror leaned against the far wall, its surface strangely clean despite the surrounding dust. Emma's reflection stared back at her, but something about it felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the longer she looked, the more uneasy she became. Turning away, she focused on the boxes, rummaging through them to find old family heirlooms, faded letters, and a few children's toys that must have belonged to her grandparents. Then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. Emma froze, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from the mirror. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Her reflection was no longer her own. The figure in the mirror looked like her, but moved differently, as if lagging behind her movements. It raised a hand to its lips and pressed a finger there, a silent gesture for her to be quiet. Emma stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, distorted voice that seemed to emanate from the mirror. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered. Terrified, Emma bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The key, still in the lock, twisted on its own, trapping her inside. She pounded on the door, screaming, but the house was empty, and no one would hear her cries. The voice came again, louder this time. "Stay." Emma spun around to face the mirror. The reflection was gone, replaced by a swirling darkness. Shapes moved within the glass, indistinct and shadowy, but their presence was undeniable. She backed away, her hands searching for something, anything, to defend herself. The shadows began to pour out of the mirror, spilling into the room like ink spreading across water. They coalesced into humanoid forms, their features blurry but their intentions clear. Emma grabbed a wooden box and hurled it at the nearest figure. It passed through harmlessly, as if the shadow weren't solid. Desperate, she grabbed a sheet from the floor and flung it over the mirror. The room fell silent. The shadows froze, then slowly receded, melting back into the covered glass. The door creaked open, and Emma didn't hesitate. She ran. She locked herself in her bedroom, clutching her phone and trying to call her parents, but the call wouldn't connect. Exhausted and terrified, she eventually fell into a restless sleep. When she woke, it was morning, and everything seemed normal. The third-floor door was shut, the key still in the lock. For a moment, she thought it might have been a nightmare. But as she descended the stairs, she stopped cold. Hanging on the wall in the living room was a new mirror. It was smaller than the one upstairs, but unmistakably the same style. And as Emma stared at it, her reflection smiled, but she didn't. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Claire's parents were away on a business trip, leaving her alone in their sprawling house for the first time. At 18, she was confident she could handle a couple of nights solo. With a fridge stocked full of snacks and plans to binge-watch horror movies, Claire was even excited about the solitude. The first night started off uneventfully. Rain drizzled outside, pattering softly against the windows. The old house creaked occasionally, but Claire had grown up here and was used to its sounds. She curled up on the couch, a bowl of popcorn in her lap, and let herself get lost in her favorite slasher film. Around midnight, she decided to call it a night. She turned off the TV and checked the locks on all the doors and windows, a routine her parents had drilled into her. The house was secure, the rain was letting up, and everything felt normal. At 2 a.m., Claire woke with a start. At first, she wasn't sure what had pulled her from sleep. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. She lay there, listening, until she heard it. A soft scraping sound, like metal against glass. Her heart skipped a beat. The sound was faint but distinct, and it was coming from the direction of the living room. Claire grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as she crept down the hallway. Her bare feet made no sound on the hardwood floor. When she reached the living room, everything appeared normal. The windows were still locked, the curtains drawn. She checked each one just to be sure. Satisfied, she returned to her room, telling herself it had been her imagination. But as she climbed back into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, Claire went about her routine, but the unease from the night before lingered. She double-checked the locks and even considered calling her parents to tell them what had happened, but she didn't want to worry them over what was likely nothing. That evening, the rain returned, heavier this time. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Claire settled on the couch with a blanket and her laptop. She was halfway through an old thriller when the power went out. The sudden darkness swallowed the room, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning. Claire groaned, grabbing her phone to use as a flashlight. She made her way to the kitchen to check the fuse box. As she fumbled with the panel, a loud knock echoed through the house. The sound came from the front door, sharp and deliberate. Claire froze, her hand hovering over the switches. She hadn't heard anyone pull into the driveway, and the idea of someone walking up to the house in this storm sent a chill down her spine. The knock came again, louder this time. Heart pounding, Claire grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Lightning illuminated the front yard through the window. Claire saw no one. She peeked through the peephole but saw only the rain-soaked porch. Slowly, she unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, keeping the chain in place. No one was there. She shut the door quickly, re-locked it, and retreated to the living room, trying to steady her breathing. It was probably just a prank, she told herself. But as she sat there, staring at the door, she noticed something. The window beside the door had a single handprint on the glass, smudged and streaking downward, as if someone had pressed against it and slid away. That night, Claire barely slept. Every noise set her on edge. Every shadow seemed to move. By morning, she was exhausted, but relieved to see the sunlight streaming through the windows. She made herself a cup of coffee and tried to shake off the fear. Around noon, Claire decided to walk around the property. She told herself it was just to clear her head, but she couldn't deny the nagging feeling that something was wrong. As she circled the house, she found muddy footprints near the living room window. They led from the forest at the edge of their backyard to the house and then back again. The prints were large, too big to be hers. Her stomach churned. She ran back inside and locked the door, her mind racing. Should she call the police? Tell her parents? She felt foolish, imagining their reactions. "It's probably just some kid messing around," her dad would say. But deep down, Claire wasn't convinced. That night, the real terror began. The rain had stopped, leaving the night eerily quiet. Claire was in bed, trying to distract herself with a book, when she heard it again, the scraping sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from the living room. It was outside her bedroom window. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed nothing but her reflection in the glass. She waited, heart pounding, until a shadow moved across the window. Claire screamed, dropping the phone. She grabbed the knife she'd kept by her bed and backed into the corner of the room. The shadow lingered for a moment before disappearing. She heard footsteps on the roof, slow and deliberate, moving toward the attic. Summoning her courage, Claire ran out of the room and down the stairs. She locked herself in the bathroom, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline, but the wait for the police felt eternal. When they arrived, they searched the house and the surrounding area but found no one. The attic was empty, and the muddy footprints outside had been washed away by the earlier rain. The officers assured Claire that she was safe, but their words did little to comfort her. Her parents returned the next day, worried but skeptical. "You've always had an active imagination," her mother said gently. Claire didn't argue. She knew what she'd seen, what she'd heard. And as she lay in bed that night, listening to the house creak, she couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, had been outside wasn't finished with her yet. As she drifted into a fitful sleep, a single thought lingered in her mind. The handprint on the window had been on the inside,